Hi, I'm Tom. This video is going to take a look at the second contrapunctus from Bach's The Art of Fugue. You can also find an analysis of the first contrapunctus on my channel, which I recommend you take a look at. You don't have to have seen it in order to understand this video, but it is interesting to see how the two pieces relate to each other. Anyway, I hope you find this video useful. It's a wonderful contrapunctus. It's full of fascinating detail. So let's dive right in. The first section of a fugue is known as the exposition, and we begin with the subject in the bass stated in the same form as we heard it in the first contrapunctus, but with one crucial difference, namely this dotting of the rhythm of the tail. I say crucial because, as in the first contrapunctus, there isn't really a discrete melodic countersubject per se, and instead it's this dotted rhythm that's going to emerge as the defining feature of the accompanying material. After the statement of the subject in the bass, the answer enters in the tenor on the dominant note, A, taking the same form the initial answer took in the first contrapunctus. That is to say, a tonal answer, with that perfect fourth leap rather than the perfect fifth in the subject, and the major second instead of the minor second at the end. In our analysis of the first contrapunctus, we talked about the reasons for these changes, so I won't go into it again here, but if you haven't seen that, I recommend you take a look. So the answer is accompanied by the dotted rhythm until we reach this perfect fourth leap in the bass, which anticipates the perfect fifth in the alto as the subject returns, accompanied by statements of the dotted motif again, this time woven together in imitatory dialogue between the tenor and bass voices. Finally, the last voice, the soprano voice, enters as we expect with the answer. But now we have a B natural instead of the B flat in the tail, a point we'll come back to in a moment when we discuss the harmony. The inverted dotted motif accompanies the perfect fourth in the soprano answer with a rising perfect fifth that echoes the D to A leap at the beginning of the subject. And the dotted motif then continues to accompany the answer in various guises, again with imitation playing a prominent role. So we've now heard either the subject or the answer in each of the four voices, which means we've reached the end of the exposition. Harmonically, we started in D minor, and the subject stays in D minor without modulating, before the answer is given in the minor dominant key, A minor. This new key is reached by the introduction of notes from the A minor pitch collection, so we get B naturals which contradict the D minor key signature, for example. And notice, by the way, that one of the reasons this modulation to the dominant is so smooth, together with the use of the tonal answer that we discussed in the first video, is that Bach has avoided using the note B flat up to this point, meaning that these B naturals don't jar, and the only change the ear needs to process at first is the flattening of the C sharp to C natural in the same voice. With the C and B naturals established, our ear is then ready to process the arrival of the last and most important note in the A minor pitch collection, namely the leading note, G sharp. In typical fugue fashion, the subject then returns in the tonic key, D minor, so Bach has to make a much quicker harmonic turnaround this time. He does this by flattening the B natural in the same voice to reintroduce the B flat, and likewise flattening the G sharp to G natural in the same voice. We return to A minor for the final entry of the exposition, and then we get what is probably my favourite part of this particular fugue, the first episode. So let's take a look at this episode from a harmonic point of view. The first time we heard the answer, we had to modulate to D minor rapidly and unambiguously for the return of the subject, if you remember, hence the quick introduction of B flat and G natural. But this time, Bach has more room to manoeuvre. He is going to return to D minor again, but he uses this episode to take his time over it. Hence we get the B natural instead of B flat, as we said before, with B flat not appearing until a couple of bars into the episode. We also keep that G sharp so that it sounds like this E chord, the dominant of A minor, is going to drop onto an A chord to create a perfect cadence in A minor or perhaps A major. This is exactly what the upper voices seem to do, but there's no C or C sharp on the accented beat to indicate the third of the chord. And more importantly, the bass completes the upward scalar motion to arrive at F. As so often with Bach, it is the bass that is the controlling element here. We're moving down in thirds, and we're sequencing this melodic figuration, which occurs 3 times and is then simplified for the final iteration. Thus we have an ascent to that F, followed by a descent to the E. This descent is paralleled in the alto, while the tenor imitates the sequenced bass figuration. These powerful melodic connections allow Bach to shift the harmony smoothly and naturally through D minor and then G minor. In other words, cycling down in fifths until we return to that E major sonority that preceded the episode. This time with the minor seventh, meaning that we have an E dominant seventh chord, which has a very strong pullback to the key of A. Bach signals that we are approaching an important structural point by silencing the alto and tenor and holding the E pedal-like in the bass, while the soprano noodles around the minor seventh D. This building anticipation is released by the alto and tenor returning to complete a full E chord, and the minor seventh of the E7 chord following its strong gravitational pull to the third of the chord a fifth below, namely the C sharp of an A major chord, meaning that we have a cadence onto the chord of A major. What happens next is a fascinatingly unconventional re-entry of the subject here. It's unconventional firstly in that it's not preceded by rests in the entering voice, which is the textbook practice, in order to draw the ear's attention to the subject entry. Secondly, the first note of the subject is missing. Instead we have the dotted motif. Thirdly, the melodic impetus at first seems to be driven by the cascading imitations of the dotted motif. So it's this that our ear tends to latch on to before realizing that the subject is returned. All of this taken together means that the subject is heard less as re-entering into the contrapuntal texture as emerging out of it. It's as if Bach has taken his thumb to the charcoal sketch and just smudged the edges, giving us something much more interesting, much more organic, something we wouldn't really see in the textbooks. The return of the subject takes us into a section known as the counter-exposition. It's called the counter-exposition primarily for harmonic reasons, namely that we continue to hear the subject and answer in the same keys in which we heard them in the exposition, so D minor and A minor, the tonic and the dominant. In a typical counter-exposition, the answer is heard in the voices that initially had the subject and vice versa, often with the answer leading. But Bach chooses not to follow that scheme here, with the alto and bass taking the subject as before, and the soprano and then tenor with the answer like the first time around. But more typically, Bach does take the opportunity in this counter-exposition to play around with the distance of entry, bringing in the soprano answer stretto-like before the alto subject has finished, necessitating an adaptation to the end of the subject to accommodate the early change to the A minor key. Bach also hints at a continuation of the stretto in the bass that turns out to be a feint. And he goes up instead of down at the end of the answer to give a sense of unfinished business before leaving a bars codetta between the end of the soprano and the entry of the bass. And a more prolonged 3-bar codetta before the tenor enters after the bass statement. Imitative iterations of the dotted motif accompany throughout, of course, but we also get these hints of the final part of the theme. And as we prepare for the next section of the fugue, we get brief anticipations of the beginning of the theme. The counter-exposition finishes on the first beat of bar 42, and we enter a section we'll call the development, beginning with a 3-bar episode with those anticipatory leaps we noted earlier, building expectation for the next entry of the theme, which arrives here in the form of the subject, now in the relative major key of F major. Rather than ending on the note it began with, as the subject usually does, this iteration of the subject slips up a semitone on the last note to F sharp, taking us into a version of the theme in G minor. This key change was foreshadowed earlier in the Contrapunctus, if you remember, in bars 19 and 20, but note that on that occasion we were just passing through, and Bach was careful to avoid G minor's characteristic E flats to avoid a clash with the very prominent E natural in the bass of the following bar. Here, however, we have a full modulation to G minor, and Bach uses E flats freely. This version of the theme begins with a perfect fourth leap at the beginning, rather than the usual perfect fifth. Because it begins with a perfect fourth like the answer does, some analysts describe this as a version of the answer. However, there are other analysts who describe it as a version of the subject, because the next interval is a third, like in the subject. Personally, I find it much easier just to describe it as a version of the theme, and a version of the theme that clearly combines elements of both the subject and the answer. And we get a similar version of the theme for the next entry, adapted to the new key of B-flat major, the relative major of G minor, which takes us to the next episode. Before we move to the next episode, let's just take a look at the material accompanying the thematic entries here, because as usual, Bach has populated this with fascinating contrapuntal detail. Firstly, we get examples of what could be seen as imitation per arsin et thesin, namely imitation with reversed accents. That is to say, that the notes which in the pattern are on accented beats are in the imitation on unaccented, and vice versa. Thus, in bar 45, the B flat and G go from strong to weak, and the A and F from weak to strong. Likewise in bars 49 to 51, and also here, and in bars 53 and 55. Secondly, we have as always imitations in inversion, that is, upside down. We have anticipations and echoes. For example, the perfect fourth leap at the beginning of the G minor theme is anticipated in the preceding bars, as is its stepwise ascent. This ascent is also echoed in bar 52, and also here, while that minor third drop in the theme we mentioned earlier is anticipated in inverted diminutions above, and the opening perfect fourth is echoed by its inversion, a perfect fifth. The perfect fourth leap is also recalled in the tenor, and then this perfect fourth is imitated per arsin et thesin again. Finally, Bach uses double counterpoint to give even more unity to the fabric. If we compare bar 54 with bar 46, we see that the rising idea in the alto is the same. And this rising idea is accompanied by the drop of a major third in both cases. However, in bar 46, the major third drop was above the rising line, and in bar 54, it is below. In other words, the two parts have swapped their positions relative to each other. Parts that are able to exchange positions in this way, whilst maintaining effective voice leading and harmonic interaction, is known as double counterpoint. Here the top part has dropped down a compound 12, so we call this double counterpoint at the 12th. There's a similar example in bar 53. If we compare it with bar 49, we see that these two lines switch their relative positions in bar 53, inverting in the 14th. So let's listen to this section again, this time with an ear to the accompanying detail. The next episode is the final episode before what we'll call the recapitulation, when the subject returns in the tonic key. By now, of course, fragments of the different parts of the theme are easy to hear: the end, the middle, the leap at the start, and importantly we get a sudden drop in activity in the tenor and bass. There's this sense of time slowing down, a kind of suspended animation. This hanging B flat in the bass really stands out as we wait for it to drop onto the dominant note, A, and then for the dominant A to cadence onto the tonic note, D. Which is why when that D does arrive, announcing the return of the subject back in the tonic key of D minor, we get that satisfying jolt of release, like the aeroplane touching down on the tarmac, the sense that we're entering the final leg of our journey. So the recapitulation begins with the subject in D minor. We then get a 4-bar episode, and then the answer returns in the dominant key of A minor. Note how the subject is accompanied by imitations of the scalar motif that are then echoed in compressed, diminuted form. Notice also how the episode is controlled by a descending sequence in thirds that recalls the similar descending third sequence we saw in the first episode of the Contrapunctus, in bars 17 to 21. The perfect fourth leap that starts the answer is anticipated by the bass in the preceding bar, which then goes on to evoke the midsection of the D minor subject, and then repeat it a step down, providing the rhythmic pulse against which the answer is syncopated, entering as it does on an offbeat. Meanwhile, the dotted rhythm continues, as always, shared between soprano and alto in bar 70, and we come to the final episode. This last episode takes us to the final statement of the theme, the subject in the tonic key of D minor. The episode signals that we're approaching the end of the Contrapunctus by keeping us hanging on a dominant pedal, a sustained A, the dominant note of D minor, holding back the momentum of the shifting harmonies above it, while the tail motif is again sequenced downwards, this time in the soprano after an evocation of the syncopated perfect fourth leap of the preceding answer, and while the midsection scale that was highlighted by the bass 4 bars previously is now taken up by the tenor. As indicated in the footnote, Bach originally finished this Contrapunctus here, with the A major chord stated in semi-breathes. Ending on the dominant in this way, as well as having the final iteration of the theme be the answer rather than the subject, would have given this contrapunctus a very open-ended feel, suggesting that perhaps Bach originally intended it to lead into a subsequent piece. But ultimately, as we see, he elected to fully round off the contrapunctus with a return of the subject, leading into this with an imitation of the soprano sequence on the same pitches in the bass, and then closing with a tonic pedal, a sustained D in the soprano, that leads us from an interrupted cadence or deceptive cadence to a plagal cadence, the G minor sonority carefully prepared in previous modulations leading to a D major chord, with the F of the tonic D minor being sharpened to F sharp, a procedure known as tierce de Picardie. It's important to remember that Bach originally intended the Art of Fugue as a pedagogical aid, so it's worth taking a moment to consider what lessons Bach may have wanted us to take from this contrapunctus. I'd suggest 3. Firstly, the character of a fugue is often defined more by the accompanying material than by the themes themselves. The theme for Contrapunctus 1 and Contrapunctus 2 is basically the same, but the two pieces couldn't sound more different. The first is meditative. The second is upbeat and playful. And this is all due to the respectively tranquil and rhythmic nature of the non-thematic material in each. Secondly, Bach saw music as an expression of the order of the cosmos, and I think he's demonstrating here how, in a well-composed musical universe, even the smallest musical event can have profound ramifications for the whole. So the only thing Bach needs to do to create alternative musical realities in the first two pieces of the Art of Fugue is to make a tiny alteration to these seemingly inconsequential linking notes at the end of the theme. Finally, I think Bach is just showing us how much variety and interest can be derived from the smallest of musical elements. We all love a triple fugue, we love it when composers bring together multiple themes into a single tapestry at the end, and nobody does that better than Bach. But what Bach seems to be saying to the student here is, we don't need to have a multiplicity of ideas to get started writing good fugues. What we do need is one idea, and the curiosity and patience to explore the infinite multiplicity and potential within that.